August 12th, 1940. The chalk downs above Ventnor on the Isle of Wight shimmer in the late summer heat. Below in the town itself, the radar station has just been hit by Junkers Ju-88s in one of the opening strikes of Adler Angriff. Eagle Attack, the Luftwaffe's systematic campaign to destroy fighter command before the invasion barges cross the channel. Smoke rises from the aerials. The operators are already dead or wounded. Across southern England on this same morning, German bombers are hitting airfields, radar stations, and the infrastructure that keeps the Royal Air Force alive. Hermann Göring has promised Adolf Hitler that fighter command will be broken within 4 weeks. His intelligence officers have told him, with some confidence, that the British are running out of aircraft. They are wrong. They are wrong in a way that will cost Germany the war, and the reason they are wrong is sitting in a tunnel carved into the sandstone cliffs of the Isle of Wight, in a network of underground chambers that the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance pilots have never identified, where 2,200 brand new Hawker Hurricanes are stored in protective crates, carefully catalogued, waiting to replace every aircraft that fighter command loses faster than the Germans expect. This is the story of how Britain hid an entire air force underground, why it was necessary, how it was built, and why almost nobody has heard of it. The crisis that produced the underground storage program did not begin in the summer of 1940. It began in the late 1930s, when the Air Ministry's planners looked honestly at the production figures coming out of the Hawker aircraft factory at Kingston upon Thames and the shadow factories beginning to produce Hurricanes at Gloucester Aircraft in Brockworth, and the Austin Motor Company works at Longbridge in Birmingham, and concluded that the rate of production was outpacing the rate at which trained pilots and operational squadrons could absorb new aircraft. By the spring of 1940, Hawker and its shadow factory partners were producing Hurricanes at a rate that had climbed from approximately 40 aircraft per month in 1938 to well over 200 per month by early 1940, a figure that would peak at over 500 per month by the summer. The Hurricane, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin, 3-engine producing 1,030 horsepower, armed with 8.303-inch Browning machine guns and capable of 340 miles per hour at 17,500 feet, was being built faster than it could be flown. This sounds like an enviable problem. It was not. Aircraft sitting on the surface at Hawker's Canbury Park Road facility in Kingston, or at the Gloucester Works in Gloucestershire, or at any of the dispersal airfields around southern England, were catastrophically vulnerable. The Luftwaffe's pre-war intelligence gathering had been thorough. German agents and aerial reconnaissance had identified the major production facilities. The Heinkel, He-111S and Dornier Do-17S that would carry out the bombing campaign were perfectly capable of reaching Kingston, Brockworth and Longbridge. A single successful strike on a concentrated surface storage depot could destroy in 20 minutes what it had taken a factory 6 weeks to produce. The Air Ministry had studied what German bombing had done to Republican aircraft stocks during the Spanish Civil War, and what the Luftwaffe had done to Polish and French Air Force reserves in 1939 and 1940. The conclusion was unambiguous. Aircraft stored on the surface in concentrated numbers were not a reserve. They were a target. The existing solution, dispersing aircraft across grass fields and satellite airfields, was inadequate for the quantities now being produced. A grass field could hide 4 or 5 Hurricanes under camouflage netting. It could not hide 200. Camouflage paint and netting could reduce visibility from altitude, but German reconnaissance aircraft, flying at 30,000 feet with the latest Zeiss optical equipment, could identify dispersed aircraft with uncomfortable reliability. Something more radical was required. The aircraft had to go underground. The facility that answered this requirement was the creation of the Directorate General of Works, operating under the Air Ministry, in conjunction with the geological survey teams who had been quietly assessing the chalk and sandstone formations of southern England since 1937. The Isle of Wight had been identified as the primary site for a specific combination of reasons. The island's position in the Solent offered natural protection. It was not on any obvious route to a major industrial target, and Luftwaffe planners focusing their limited reconnaissance assets on Southampton, Portsmouth, and the Thames estuary had limited resources to waste on secondary targets. More critically, the soft but stable green sand and chalk formations beneath the island's downs offered exactly the geological conditions that tunneling engineers required, soft enough to excavate relatively quickly using the pneumatic boring equipment available in 1938 and 1939, yet stable enough to require minimal reinforcement once the chambers were cut. The primary complex centred on a system of natural caverns, enlarged and interconnected beneath the cliffs between Ventnor and St. Lawrence, eventually extended to approximately 9,000 square metres of usable underground floor space, roughly equivalent to covering 12 standard football pitches with a ceiling of roughly 7 metres. The engineering work was carried out between March 1938 and September 1939 by a workforce that peaked at approximately 800 men, drawn from the mining communities of South Wales and Durham, and managed by the civil engineering firm of Sir Robert McAlpine. The workers were housed in temporary accommodation under cover stories that described the project variously as a new water reservoir, a cable relay station, and, most persistently, an extension to the existing coastal defence infrastructure. Security was strict without being conspicuous. Workers signed the Official Secrets Act without being told precisely what they were signing it for. Letters home were read. The payroll was administered through a dummy company registered in Cardiff. When the tunnelling was complete, the chambers were fitted with climate control systems designed and installed by the Carrier Corporation's British subsidiary, maintaining temperature and humidity at the precise levels required to prevent corrosion of the aluminium airframes and the Merlin engines. Each Hurricane, delivered from the factories by road on low loaders after dark, was partially disassembled, wings removed, propeller detached, and stored in a purpose-built wooden crating system that allowed the aircraft to be stacked in 2 tiers within the 7-metre chambers. A Hurricane with wings removed measured 26 feet in length and just over 8 feet in width at the fuselage, allowing the storage chambers to accommodate aircraft in rows of remarkable density. Production numbers for the facility remain partially classified, even today, which is itself a remarkable fact about a program that is now more than 80 years old. What can be stated with confidence, drawing on the partial records released under the 30-year rule and the subsequent Freedom of Information disclosures of the 1990s, is that by 15th September 1940, the date now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, the Isle of Wight complex held stocks that the Air Ministry's internal documents describe as sufficient to replace Fighter Command's entire frontline Hurricane strength, approximately 3 times over. The figure of 2,200 aircraft, which appears in several secondary sources, is consistent with the known floor space and storage configuration of the facility, though the precise number on any given date fluctuated as aircraft were drawn down and replaced. The operational use of the reserve was deliberately managed to be invisible. This was the point. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command from his headquarters at Bentley Priory in Stanmore, Middlesex, was acutely aware that German intelligence was watching British squadron strengths with intense interest. If replacement aircraft appeared too quickly and too consistently after major losses, Luftwaffe analysts would be forced to conclude either that production rates were higher than believed or that reserves were being drawn from a source they had not identified. Dowding's staff managed the release of aircraft from the Isle of Wight facility through a carefully calibrated system that matched replacement rates to what German intelligence might plausibly attribute to accelerated factory output. Aircraft were moved from the island by night, transported on Royal Navy vessels to the mainland, and delivered to maintenance unit facilities at Lynham in Wiltshire and St Athan in South Wales for reassembly and air testing before distribution to squadrons. The psychological impact on German planning was, in retrospect, decisive. Luftwaffe intelligence chief Josef Schmid, whose analyses of RAF strength were notoriously optimistic from the German perspective, consistently reported through August and September 1940 that Fighter Command was approaching the point of collapse. The loss rates Schmid's analysts were observing in the air battles over southern England should, by their calculations, have reduced RAF fighter strength below operational viability by early September. Instead, British squadrons kept appearing. Replacement aircraft kept arriving. The number of Hurricanes and Spitfires rising to meet each German raid refused to decline at the rate the models predicted. Schmid's reports became increasingly strained. Göring, furious, accused his pilots of overclaiming their kills. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The German approach to aircraft reserve storage presents an instructive contrast. The Luftwaffe maintained its reserve aircraft in surface facilities at a series of Luftpark depots, large purpose-built storage parks distributed across occupied France and the Low Countries. The largest of these, at Châteaudun in the Loire Valley, held approximately 350 aircraft at peak capacity. The facilities were camouflaged but remained on the surface, and when Allied bombing eventually reached them in 1943 and 1944, the losses in stored aircraft were severe. The Germans had considered underground storage as a concept, but dismissed it on grounds of cost and the time required for geological survey and tunnelling. Their planning horizon for the French campaign had been months, not years, and the infrastructure investment required for a programme equivalent to the Isle of Wight facility could not be justified within the timeframes they were working to. The Americans, arriving in Britain from 1942 onwards, were shown elements of the Isle of Wight programme. Not the facility itself, whose location remained classified, but the general concept and the climate control specifications, and incorporated the principles into their own reserve storage planning for the European theatre. The United States Army Air Forces established underground fuel and ammunition dumps along similar lines in several locations across southern England, though no equivalent aircraft storage facility on the British scale was ever constructed by American engineers. The Soviet Union, facing the catastrophic losses of 1941 and 1942, improvised underground storage in the Ural caves and mine systems, but without the climate control infrastructure that made the Isle of Wight facility effective in preserving aircraft in airworthy condition for extended periods. The legacy of the Isle of Wight underground storage programme operates on several levels simultaneously. At the most direct level, the reserve it maintained made the arithmetic of the Battle of Britain work in Britain's favour at precisely the moment when German intelligence believed the arithmetic was working in theirs. Every week that Fighter Command continued to put viable numbers of aircraft into the air over southern England was a week in which the window for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed German amphibious invasion, narrowed. Hitler's directive postponing the invasion indefinitely was issued on September 17, 1940, 2 days after the Luftwaffe suffered its heaviest single-day losses of the campaign. The reserve had not won the battle alone. Dowding's tactics, the courage of the pilots, the performance of the radar chain, the skill of the ground controllers, all of these mattered enormously. But without the reserve, the arithmetic might have turned in the final weeks of August and early September, when Fighter Command's losses were at their most severe and the pressure on squadron serviceability was at its most acute. The longer legacy is institutional rather than material. The principle of hardened, geologically protected reserve storage for critical military assets, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, command facilities, became embedded in British defence planning in a way that persisted through the Cold War and beyond. The network of underground facilities built beneath the British countryside during the 1950s and 1960s, including the regional seats of government and the protected communications bunkers of the UKWMO, drew directly on the expertise and doctrine developed by the Directorate General of Works during the Isle of Wight programme. The men who had supervised the Ventnor tunnelling in 1938 and 1939 were the same men, or their direct professional successors, who assessed the Corsham stone mines in Wiltshire as a site for central government war headquarters in the early 1950s. The thread runs directly through. As for the physical facility itself, the Isle of Wight complex was decommissioned in stages between 1946 and 1951. The climate control equipment was removed first. The access tunnels were sealed with concrete plugs. The chambers themselves, stripped of their fittings, were left essentially intact. The geology that had made them useful in 1940 made them equally stable and equally untroubling to simply close and walk away from. Whether any of the infrastructure survives in visitable condition today is not a matter of public record. The island's tourist industry has never, to this author's knowledge, promoted a connection to the facility. Return then to that August morning above Ventnor. The radar station is burning, the Junkers are turning for home, and beneath the chalk and sandstone of the cliffs above the town, in chambers that the German aircrew have just flown directly over without knowing they exist, 2,200 Hawker Hurricanes sit in the dark in their wooden crates waiting. The Luftwaffe has just struck what they believe is a critical blow against Britain's ability to defend herself. They have destroyed a radar station. They have not touched the reserve. They do not know the reserve exists. They will spend the next 6 weeks destroying aircraft that Britain replaces faster than their models say is possible, drawing down a reserve that their intelligence has never located, fighting a battle of attrition that their mathematics says they are winning and losing. The hurricanes in the dark won the Battle of Britain as surely as the hurricanes in the air. You cannot destroy what you cannot find. You cannot win an attrition battle against an enemy whose reserves are invisible. Britain hid 2,200 fighters in a cliff, and Germany never knew. That is why the invasion barges never sailed. That is why the RAF kept flying. That is the battle that nobody saw, fought entirely underground in the dark, in the silence by engineers and tunnel workers and climate control specialists whose names appear in no squadron diary and no combat report. They won anyway,